If we're going to trace the history of the Enlightenment and its influence, we need to begin with the figure of René Descartes. He is most notable for the way in which he develops his philosophical system by beginning with an attitude of universal doubt. He writes that it's possible to doubt everything except for the existence of the doubting self. So if I'm doubting whether, as he writes in his famous treatise on this, whether the candle he's looking at as it's melting is actually a candle, is actually there, and is actually giving off all the effects of being a candle, he can't doubt that he is someone sitting there doubting this candle. And so he coins the famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am," cogito ergo sum. The I in that statement, "I think, therefore I am," is the thinking subject. So the mind that's doubting is there and is stable. But the existence of the very body the mind is within could also still be doubted. So Descartes needs to discern how to prove that his body exists. And he does this, he discerns by needing to prove the existence of a creator. By making that move from body to creator, we're seeing how Descartes is still operating within a Christian context. So Enlightenment thinkers themselves were not necessarily anti-Christian. They are simply pushing the boundaries of philosophical discourse as it is situated within a Christian society. And so as he moves through this, he argues that the idea of a perfect being greater than oneself exists in the mind. But the mind can't produce such an idea, he argues, and here we can begin to debate with Descartes. But he argues, no, this idea of a being greater than itself is something implanted there by God. And so this helps Descartes prove that God actually exists. So by knowing the existence of God and having trust in such a divine being, one can then accept that the world as we perceive it actually exists, and thus our own body. This then helps him resolve the philosophical conundrum he got himself in with this statement, "I think, therefore I am." One of the things we can notice with what Descartes is up to here is that he is privileging the perspective of the subjective self over collective reality. That is, he discounts the experience of others in society around him and says the only thing that I can rely on is my own thinking self, not the experiences of others. And so this is a key Enlightenment move, to prioritize the autonomous individual over the community. And I'd argue we're still dealing with the after effects of that particular Enlightenment move. The United States emphasis on individualism, individual common sense, individual pragmatism, we can all see is actually tracing out from a French philosopher, Descartes. Of course, Descartes influences others, and in an English-speaking context, the philosophy of John Locke really shapes Anglo-American thinking. We see this in his 1690 essay on human understanding. So Locke gets into a debate with Descartes, and he wants to argue, against Descartes' notion that there are these innate ideas that one can discover by looking within the self. Locke says no. The only true knowledge that we have is based on experience. So instead of looking inwardly, he wants to look outwardly into what we're going to call empiricism. Right? So he has these three levels of experience that he offers. The first is the experience of the self. That there's the continual experience of the self and the intellect. That we have all this data we gather, these points of knowledge from our own self-experience. And then there's also experience via outward realities. That is what is before us as human beings. our experience of the sensory world. What knowledge do I gather by encountering this world around me? And then there's experience gained via God. That the existence of God is proven by the existence of ourself and the experiences it has. Beyond this, he argues, there's no certain knowledge. That is, if I'm told about something I haven't had direct experience of, do I actually know it exists and it's true? So I'm told of these other lands. How do I know about them? So this way of thinking gives rise to the philosophical school of empiricism, that certainty rests in only what can be observed. And so reason, our systems of knowledge, are produced by the world of objects all around us. Now, obviously, this is going to have a lot of effects for Christianity, which puts a lot of stock in things that can't be objectively perceived. And so we have to move to the category of faith, Locke argues. Faith, then, is an assent to knowledge based on revelation. Faith always exists in the area of probable knowledge. That is, we have this revelation from Scripture. People have told us it's trustworthy, so we choose to assent to it, but that knowledge is never certain in empirical terms. It always exists in this realm of probable knowledge. So we use reason, we use our judgment to determine the probability of what one is asked to believe is actually true. So here, a real pragmatic way of thinking. Just as an aside, Locke here is writing in 1690. He's writing as a member of the Church of England. He's writing after the restoration of the Church of England. And he's writing actually as a reader of Richard Hooker and his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. And scholars have noted very similar parallel ways in which Hooker's method is employed by Locke. Locke writes this treatise on the reasonableness of Christianity in order for him to unpack these categories of probable knowledge. And he wants to argue that given everything we know, Christianity is the most reasonable religion. He wants to argue that reason on its own cannot establish morality in a clear way, and so we need religion or revelation to give us morality. So God sends Jesus Christ to teach people, gives them revelation regarding morality in order to accelerate human knowledge to move to the most moral possible state. And so Christian theology, Christian philosophy have better moral systems than other kinds of philosophy, like Platonism or Aristotelianism, because its principles are based on revelation from God. But note the very kind of functional way, very pragmatic way that now Locke is framing the purpose of religion, the purpose of Christianity, is to make us moral beings. If that is the core purpose of religion, to make us moral, what happens if other more persuasive models of morality emerge? So this is a question for Christians to wrestle with. Is the purpose of the incarnation to make us moral? What was the purpose of the incarnation? What is the purpose of revelation? If the purpose of being Christian is to be a good person, that might get undermined when other persuasive moral systems come on the scene. What would be the answer to that? This question of religion and morality really is foregrounded by the development of another philosophical school in this context known as deism. This is a philosophical religious movement designed to transcend the very frequent arguments about religious belief and orthodoxy that happened over the course of the 17th century. The 30 Years' War in Europe, the English Civil War in the British Isles, and also to try to deal with the problem of just dismissive skepticism about all belief. And so deism has 5 basic points. It affirms 1, the existence of God; 2, the obligation to worship God; 3, that such worship has an accompanying ethical moral system to it; So then fourth, the need to repent, that is to amend one's life, to live in a more moral and ethical way. And the certainty that punishment and reward exists in this life and in the life beyond. So we see here now that Christian ethics is being reduced to really what we call natural religion, that religion is simply the morality we can discern. No real emphasis on the importance of the content of revelation. And so then a real de-emphasis on the significance of Jesus Christ for living a moral life. And we see this play out in some of the famous deists that we know of in a United States context, people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, who really reduce Christianity to a moral system. And so again, the Enlightenment presents a challenge to Christianity. Is Christianity a moral system at its foundation? Is that the purpose of Christianity, to be a moral system? Obviously, we want Christianity to be moral, but is that all that there is to Christianity? If Christianity is reduced to a moral system, what's the point of saying Jesus Christ is the incarnate Son of God? What's the point of having a doctrine of the Trinity? But there's also a question then of transcendence. Does reducing Christianity to a moral system reduce the transcendence, reduce the possibility of spiritual formation? Does it allow for the possibility of liberation from oppression, from sins? Again, these are the challenges now that Enlightenment thinking begins to provide to Christianity. Our final significant figure, the figure who typically stands at an endpoint for talking about the Enlightenment, is the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And we want to look at two things that he wrote. One is a document in 1781 called The Critique of Pure Reason. In this, he rejects the notion that reason is subject to the laws of nature. That is, that he wants to argue that reason operates independent of empiricism, as John Locke would argue. And so he wants that human liberty rests in being able to transcend the world of things. That's the inner life, it's the intellect, it's the spirit that moves beyond just being impinged upon the material reality. So as a corollary, he wants to say that there's no such thing as innate ideas, that there are no ideas that are just magically planted in our minds that humans simply have. So here he's really rejecting Platonism. Rather, he wants to argue that there are structures of mind that store sensory data. So in some ways, you need to imagine the mind as a chest full of drawers. That chest is the mind, the drawers are the structures of the mind. And so we have structures like time, space. He develops 12 other categories that include things like causality, like seeing cause and effect. Existence, that something is. Substance, that something has dimensions to it. And so the mind orders the diversity of all these different sensations, time, space, causality, substance, existence, etc., into then discrete events or into a composite that then we understand as experience. So reality in some ways is highly fractured for Kant, and the mind orders reality, and then that is the operation of reason, is making sense of it. So there's no purely objective knowledge, but one of the knowledge that exists from the mind's own activities. So our knowledge, our intuitions construct how we perceive reality. Now we can see the real influence here then is that my subjective knowledge might be different from your subjective knowledge. So how do we get our different forms of knowledge to interact and cooperate with each other? For Christianity, this also causes a real challenge because Kant removes many of the ways of making arguments for Christian doctrine. Christian doctrine depends on things like proving the existence of God. But if existence isn't derived from reality itself, but from the way our mind operates, then maybe we can't know about God's existence objectively. If our definitions of Trinity or of the nature of Jesus Christ rely on the Hellenistic philosophical category of substance, but again, substance is a category of the mind and not something that's derived from objective reality, what do we do with our Christological and Trinitarian formulations? But just because reason can't know about God's existence or substance as a category created by the mind, this doesn't mean that these things aren't true. We just need to have other means of talking about them. And so this moves us to Kant's Critique of Practical Reason, written in 1788. And here he says practical reason, that is how one operates in the world, is based on a moral life in which the existence of God is known. So that is, we know about God through the ways in which we behave morally. Religion is based on morality, and God rewards morality. Indeed, Kant wants to argue, if there is no God, there is no reason to be moral. So morality and the existence of God are tightly linked. Morality then must be produced by reason and can't simply be derived from external laws like revelation. But then this rearranges relationships between human subjects. That is, external norms are going to become harder and harder to rationalize. And once you remove, as you see in the late 19th century with atheism, the existence of God, then the rationale for morality begins to disappear. We see this in a figure like Friedrich Nietzsche. And his atheism also significantly reorders his understanding of morality, so that power becomes the most moral thing instead of care and love for others, which is still what Kant wants to uphold. So as we get to Kant, we begin to see the real challenges that Enlightenment thinking will have for Christianity, and we can begin to anticipate the shockwaves it's going to push through modern society. It's important to see that Enlightenment thinking co-arises in some very interesting ways. It co-emerges in other contexts. So, for example, we know of an Ethiopian scholar named Zera Yacob. I had a little link for you to read about him. And he writes right at the same time, and a little bit before Descartes begins to write. And he argues for many of the core Enlightenment ideals that are going to emerge in a European context. So ideas like religious toleration, the primacy of reason, equality of all people, this critique of religious systems. Ethiopia, in this time period, has Portuguese and Italian missionaries. And so we can see the exchange of ideas happening in Ethiopia also with Arabic thinking, European Christian thinking, and then Zera Yacob synthesizes all of that and so creates his own philosophical system prior to Descartes. And so this shows that there is a whole thought world out there and that these different cultural contexts aren't hermetically sealed off from each other. And it shows the real potentiality and power of the human mind. Enlightenment thinking begins to really begin to penetrate all levels of society. Merchants begin to be informed by Enlightenment thinking, politicians, clergy, and really just everyday people begin to operate using these Enlightenment categories. In the United States context, especially the category of pragmatism and common sense, that really comes out as Lockean empiricism, is really strong. Enlightenment thinking also becomes part of a broader international scholarly discourse. We see this in the figure of Anton Amo, who was also a person we read about in this article I shared with you, who is from the region that we now call Ghana in West Africa. He is enslaved. He is brought to Amsterdam. He is given a university education. He becomes an international scholar at the University of Halle. And his writing circulates among other Europeans. He's a celebrated thinker. And we know that people from India and Islamic contexts also go to the University of Halle. And so again, there's an international exchange of Enlightenment ideals. And so it's not helpful to simply describe the Enlightenment as solely a European project, but really as a project that once it unfolds is a movement that many people become interested in and seek to engage in. And why? Because it's empowering. It empowers the individual, it heightens autonomy, it promotes pluralism, it promotes the exchange of culture, and it promotes toleration. So although Enlightenment thinking can have some really serious negative consequences, some of which we've highlighted here, there's also a great appeal for it. And that appeal is something that Christianity is going to have to navigate. So I hope this is a helpful stopping place for this week. I hope we have a lot to talk about. I look forward to our discussions.